This is episode 18 of the Women in Depth podcast. The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited to share today's conversation with you because the topic is one that impacts so many people, and that is the experience of infidelity. My guest today is Dr. Nicolle Zapien, a psychotherapist, certified sex therapist, and professor from San Francisco, California. Dr. Zapien is going to share her research and help us understand a very specific moment that happens during infidelity, and that is the beginning of an extramarital affair. She's going to talk about the thinking and feeling, the experiences that lead to a person making the decision to step over the line, the perceptions of those who cross the line, how they view themselves, their partner, and the marriage. Dr. Zapien will also provide suggestions and insights for clinicians and non-clinicians in healing after infidelity. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, our guest is Dr. Nicolle Zapien. Dr. Zapien is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice in downtown San Francisco. She's also a certified sex therapist with the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. She supervises interns and assistant professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in the Human Sexuality Doctoral Program. Hi, Dr. Zapien, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dr. Viado. Nice to be here.
I'm really excited that we're finally having this conversation. I know we've been planning it for some time, and so I'm just glad that we're finally able to connect and talk about a topic that I know happens very frequently and impacts a lot of lives. Just by starting off, could you share a little bit more with our audience about yourself?
Sure. I came to this particular field with an interest in studying questions that really matter. Actually, that was the impetus. And what I find is that the questions that really matter tend to be questions that have to do with relationships. And at the heart of some of the most difficult and emotional pieces of relationships lies infidelity and betrayal. And so in many ways lie in peeling back the layers, secrecy and shame and the difficulties that we all have as researchers and clinicians in getting to quote unquote the truth. And I'm saying quote unquote because the truth is quite possibly multimodal and not necessarily always agreed upon by all of us to be one particular thing. So I came to this work by a circuitous route. I've spent time in .com startups and time doing quantitative and qualitative research, time as a clinician, as an educator, and ultimately some of the most interesting questions happen to be in the landscape of sexuality and relationships.
I really love how you described that, it's about the questions that really matter. And it made me think of something a mentor, Dr. James Hollis, once said to me, that the quality of the questions that you ask determine the quality of your life. And so you have to really be intentional about asking questions that matter. So I love that that's connected to your passion with this. You spoke on it a little bit already, but could you share more or expand on why the area of infidelity and betrayal is so important? Why does it matter?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It's actually probably the most important question to ask in regards to this topic. It matters because it's really common and because there is so much shame and secrecy. So lots and lots of couples are either experiencing or wondering about infidelity or are flirting with someone online and kind of flirting with that line of, is this a betrayal or is this not within their relationship? So that is the first issue. So it's common. It's also really, really destructive to monogamy in particular. And I'm not one to say that monogamy is the only structure for any relationship. It's not. And there's lots and lots of research and personal experiences that people have with polyamory and serial monogamy and all different kinds of configurations. But what we do know is that infidelity, by definition, includes a betrayal of a promise that was made previously. And if that is the core element of what's going on, usually people find it very, very difficult to recover from those kinds of betrayals and trust that same person again. So when it comes to the clinical relationship, for example, couples will come and think that they want to divorce or think that they want to repair their relationship And in the middle of that question of can we repair this relationship and how do we repair this relationship lies the betrayal and all of the feelings. The problem for therapists is how do we quickly create a safe container and enough of a structure for people to be able to make productive use of the therapeutic environment toward answering those questions when there's so much hurt feelings and folks can't often have those discussions productively. So it's a really interesting problem that sometimes drives people to therapy, and it's a problem that therapists really have a difficult time holding or addressing. In San Francisco, in particular, there's a lot of affairs, in part because we are the hotbed of technology. There's lots of dating apps and dating tools. Lots of young people move to our city to find themselves and to explore technology and so on. And there's just many clients have come to my practice with questions of affairs, infidelity issues, and problems in their relationships. And in working that through, I realized that the clinical dialogues are not particularly sophisticated on how we can, as a profession, support our clients. There's lots of biases, lots of personal therapeutic perspectives get conflated with actual clinical judgment, so personal beliefs about marriage or fidelity, and so on. So that's why, largely, I mean, there's many reasons, but that's why the question is.
It's so complex. Just listening to you describe, I was, at the beginning of your response when you, just even defining what betrayal or infidelity is to a couple or individual, because again, those different perspectives of viewing it and what one might perceive to be a flirtation to the other person could be perceived as a betrayal. And I know I discussed this too with another guest where, we were talking about the betrayal really being defined by the person who is betrayed, because
Absolutely.
It may be different for the person who participated in the betrayal.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. Perception lies at the heart of this issue, and perception is a funny thing to study in many ways because it requires the researcher's perception and a lot of philosophical discussions about the whole phenomenon. It's fascinating. Affairs and infidelity used to be defined in terms of penetrative sex, and we've really come a long way in the legal discourse and in the clinical discourse to really define it as this subjective perceptual activity. And what that means then is that we're dealing with people's unconscious motivations and intentionalities. Sometimes we're dealing with the fact that when we promise monogamy, for example, rarely do we sit down and break down, is it okay for you to have a drink with a colleague after work? Is it okay for you to flirt and feel sexual energy with someone? Is it okay for you to go dancing with a neighbor? So there's all these questions that married couples usually don't explore. You kind of think you understand what your partner would conceive of as a betrayal, but rarely do we actually check that out in reality. And do we check it out over time?
Right.
So 10 years into it, you might have very different beliefs about what monogamy really constitutes and what a betrayal might be. And so there's this moving line, this gray area, this very complex phenomenon of really understanding the perceptual issues.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, this is fascinating. People oftentimes, and this is what my research found, people oftentimes are not a good judge of the slippery slope. So when we flirt with someone, which we may judge as not a betrayal, and our partner might even judge as not a betrayal, we feel something. And we're usually very poor judges in anticipating how we might feel after and in that anticipation of the next flirtation and how that might deepen a connection that we may not want to actually consciously deepen. So there's a lot of layers and complexity here for sure.
Yeah. Just listening to what you were describing, I think too, you're talking about the perceptions of the people in the relationship, and then you add to that, the therapist, right?
Yes,
right?
yes. What's fascinating about the perceptions of the therapist, and this is wonderful, there are many studies that have shown that a therapist's own personal experience with either divorce or marriage or polyamory or betrayal will inform and sneak into the clinical relationship. And that's not a new phenomenon. We all know about countertransference, and we all talk about trying to be non-judgmental. But this is one of the topics where therapists are notoriously poor at being non-judgmental and tend to practice therapy with the assumption that other people's relationships and desires really match their own, and fail to be able to suggest divorce, even if the therapists themselves would rather not be divorced or finds divorce problematic, for example. Not that we should be in the business of suggesting anything, but the idea that we have biases and blocks and don't open up possibilities for our clients based on our own preferences and biases.
And you can see how that slippery slope extends to the therapist, just in this is a difficult dialogue for therapists to have with themselves or to even explore in a in a training, because again, it goes back to, beyond being a therapist, therapists are human. So as therapists, we all have the same, unconscious and conscious perceptions and beliefs about infidelity or betrayal and what it should look like and what it doesn't. So really, there's so much to this.
That's absolutely right. And this is partially why I wanted to study it, in order to get away from my own beliefs and judgments so that I might be able to serve my clients better.
So, Nicolle, could you speak a little bit more about the research you did on this and maybe a little bit of how it was structured, just to kind of give a backdrop of the findings that you brought out from your studies?
Absolutely. So I wanted to, in my clinical practice, the main issue that seemed to be driving treatment protocols and the way in which clinicians were feeling biased about affairs and infidelity was this notion of the motivation to have an affair, and what happened when people went from being monogamous and having fidelity and changing into this other area. So I was very focused on the beginning of an extramarital affair and really trying to deeply understand what caused people. I approached the question with what caused them to decide to have an affair, and what was the thinking or experience that caused them to kind of step over that line and step out of their marriages. And one thing I will say, it was really challenging to get people to come forward to talk to me about these experiences. People had no problem misinterpreting my call for participants for this piece of research as a desire to speak with people who had been betrayed. And I heard many a sob story without even people agreeing to participate. They would sort of respond via email and tell me how they'd been hurt. That seems to be an easy position to hold socially, but for people to actually raise their hand and say, yes, I betrayed my spouse and here's what happened, is really difficult to get a handle on.
That's fascinating. And I can see how, that just lends to this whole shame and secrecy and almost this taboo perception of those who go outside a relationship,
Right. And I didn't want to replicate the research that is quantitative, where there are large studies of people who've had affairs. And I don't know how they've gotten their large samples, because it's really challenging to get people to come forward, as I said. But in these kinds of survey research pieces, it tends to revolve around who's most likely to have an affair and trying to find the bad guy. Kind of, is it men or is it women? Is it certain ethnicities? Is it certain religious groups? Is it certain this or that? And that felt to me like it would be not very useful and would probably just reflect the social mores of social desirability bias. The people who are willing to come forward are those who feel more apt to be able to tell their story. And those who don't come forward, thus aren't reflected in these quantitative studies, are the ones who feel most shame. So I chose a qualitative depth-oriented model, and I wanted to get the detail and the context and the nuance, but I also didn't want to focus on particularities. I wasn't interested in the particular dynamics of a particular couple or any of that. I wanted to get kind of a 50-foot-up version of the structure of infidelity. And the method that kind of belongs to that is a more philosophical method. It's called phenomenology. So I was trying very, very hard to push aside my own biases and my own viewpoint, and to try to see the experiences, what was common between all of these experiences structurally without the particularities. And what I found in these narratives that people would tell me was largely that they had backed themselves into a corner, honestly. They'd been married for a period of time and began to feel as if the sex wasn't particularly inspired, the connection was difficult and problematic. And anyone who's been in a long-term relationship should know that feeling. This is not an unfamiliar experience. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting with the people who chose to have affairs is that they fall into this place of lackluster sex and lackluster connection. And at the same time, they have a perception of themselves as kind of passion-oriented, novelty-seeking, excited about life, having a quest for something inspired. And they perceive their partner as blocking access to that, not interested in new things, not particularly flexible or inspired or novel. And so right away, the backdrop of an infidelity situation is, I am interested in aliveness and you are not. And I have no hope that you will ever be. And I'm going to locate this problem inside of you as a character who's unchangeable. So you can see the setup, the hopelessness, and any therapist who's worked with a couples dynamic, oftentimes there are these kind of difficult dynamics, and one person attributes the problem to a particular person. So that's not novel yet. So what becomes novel is that the person starts to stop seeking sex or inspiration through their partner because they perceive them to be shut down, and instead sees themselves as entitled to have this kind of novel experience. And all it takes then is for them to be out in the world. Anyone who provides a novel experience, and anyone who's been out in the world knows that that can happen any moment. You can have an inspired conversation, or you can be in a cafe and someone can refer you to an interesting book or whatever. Anything like that would spark this idea of, oh, novelty and passion and inspiration is available to me. And then people are poorly able to discern that if I engage with this passionate, novel feeling for a long time, it might at some time change into eroticism. And for all of these people, the most fascinating moment in their narrative is the moment they cross the line. Suddenly, the pronouns in the description disappear. They start to say, until then it's I did this and I did that, and this other person did this and did that. And we had interesting conversations, blah, blah, blah. But then there's a moment where it changes to, and then it happened. And that was fascinating to me. There was as if they had this notion that suddenly eroticism happened to them, or some magical romantic thing happened to them. And then they were unable to decide, and then they were sex or negotiating to be in a hotel or whatever.
And so this process of getting to that line of, or the part of, and then it happened, that's not something that they're able to discern in their narrative of how they found themselves in this infidelity. It was more of, I was doing this, this, and this, and then suddenly it happened, like it just came out of the blue.
Right. And, many psychoanalysts or, any number of attachment theorists or anybody could put a theory on top of this and say, of course, that's a defense structure. That's, of course, no one wants to think of themselves as bad as they are engaging in this thing that is quite possibly problematic socially and definitely problematic relative to the promise they made. That there's ways in which we go unconscious when we do quote unquote bad things. And I'm calling it quote unquote bad because, it's obvious that it's not nice to lie to your spouse and to push aside the promise that you made. However, I think there's another layer here, and that is that it's not so much that there's defense mechanisms per se, it's that we don't fully understand decision making. A similar piece of research came out of University of Oregon, where I did my undergrad studies, by a professor named Paul Slavic, where he tested the decision-making processes of teens with smoking. And teens don't start out saying, I'm going to be a smoker. They try a puff, and they don't realize that through that puff, they've now broken down one barrier, and they don't have an addiction yet, but they don't know how to anticipate how long it will take before they do. And so I think this is that same process. The line keeps moving. I'm flirting. I'm enjoying this. This is fine. And we don't understand the power of eroticism and decision-making. There's a lot in the philosophical literature about eroticism and embodiment and how we aren't necessarily consciously always aware of sexuality and desire in the moment. And so that's where the research ultimately led us, is to this notion of, wow, if people want to be conscious of their choices and want to willfully choose them, they have to probably pay more attention to their embodied understanding of desire and arousal in the moment.
Wow. There's so much to this, just seeing this process of going from not being involved in an infidelity to being in one is really a series of steps that just move you closer towards it. And then the moment that may be described as, and then it happened, is just the next step in a sequence that is kind of predictable in that way.
That's right. That's right. What's also interesting is after the fact, all of the folks who share their stories with me recognize, oh no, I'm in deep now. I've crossed the line. And all of them felt horrified by that fact and recognized that they weren't consciously deciding to have an affair. It was only after some sort of line had been crossed that they could review and think about this particular experience. And then shame set in and problems. It's also the time that they began to consciously understand my marriage is really in dire straits. So despite the fact that all that hopelessness and shutdown happened before, they weren't really consciously entertaining my marriage is heading toward divorce because there's no hope for us to open up to one another. And I really want to have a sexual relationship. So if they're thinking that way at the beginning and not entertaining the gravity of the situation in their marriage and getting help, then they're also opening themselves up to infidelity. So folks who have that process but consider, oh no, my marriage is really in trouble, I need help, or I need to make a decision, are less likely to have an affair because there's an escape valve or a way to get to hope or homeostasis at some point.
Nicolle, could you speak a little bit more about the eroticism and the embodiment and how that plays into this? I just find that really fascinating. And I know that that's a big piece because in my work with clients, that comes up that, the sex was so great. I've never felt this way before. And there's something about that embodiment that really, really almost like concretizes and creates this bond that in their perception, they're not able to move away from.
Yes, yes. I think, both in my research, I'm studying quite a bit right now on sexual consent and what it means for something to be sexual or to not be sexual. And in sex therapy as well, folks will come in and say, we have a lackluster sex life. And oftentimes what's broken is not, sometimes folks need sexual skills or they're experiencing, erectile dysfunction or lubrication issues or something more concrete. But oftentimes it's this problem with being mindful of that there's an erotic atmosphere present and knowing how to both initiate an erotic atmosphere or not initiate an erotic atmosphere if one doesn't want to. And I think this is the main point with infidelity is if we don't know collectively and individually what is flirting, what is erotic, what is sexual, and we don't all agree on that, then we're in the realm of postmodern sociolinguistics and we're in the realm of misunderstanding. And it happens all the time. Someone whistles at you as you walk down the street. That's a cat call. Does that mean that person wants to evoke sexual energy now? Is that flirting? Is that hostile? Is it just playful? What does it mean? And I think our clients, ourselves, we're all trying to figure out how do I evoke eroticism and how do I stop eroticism? And so I spend a lot of time working with my clients, helping them figure out what is the essence of the erotic? It's partially linked to the gaze. So my gaze at another as a sexual object can be evoked at will. I can decide to view someone as an object. I can also decide to view someone as a subject with their own subjectivity and take that into consideration, which would be more like an EFT or a Gottman kind of approach to psychotherapy, and it's attachment based. An interesting person, Esther Perel, she's got a great TED Talk and many people have read her work. She wrote a book called Mating in Captivity, is exactly about this phenomenon. How do I objectify the other enough, not to put them down and use them and hurt them, but how do I objectify them enough to actually evoke sexuality and eroticism in a marriage or in a relationship that is close and collapsed and based on mutuality? So how do I do that? And that is the essence of what people don't understand. And it involves going inside and noticing what one feels and wants, being able to use skills to evoke that, being able to contain flirting urges or what have you when needed. And oftentimes people don't have any of those skills or don't have any of that awareness.
So when a couple comes to therapy or a clinician or therapist is beginning to work with a couple in this area, with the research and your findings also, how does that show up then potentially in the therapeutic encounter? How does a therapist bring that into that experience?
Yeah. So a lot of times I do, sex therapy has some behavioral components and some coaching and very directive areas, and has other areas where we get to use embodiment, go inside. I sometimes direct people to go inside and articulate and track sensations and experiences and feelings and connect them. So it's not unlike DBT or CBT in many ways, but being willing to take that into a sexual realm is really important. And a lot of therapists are either not trained or afraid to evoke sexuality in the therapeutic encounter. I'm not touching my clients. I'm not having sex with my clients. I'm trying as hard as I can not to evoke anything erotic, although, of course, I understand the idea that in the transference or countertransference, there could be eroticism, which we would have to process. But the idea is to help facilitate couples or individuals to be able to notice first what they're feeling, what they're not feeling. Psychoanalysts have done this for, centuries or century, helping people understand that which is unconscious. But bringing it into like a somatic perspective is something that psychoanalysts necessarily did not do. And so this is where we bridge the idea of the push down wishes or the difficulties in asking for what one wants and recognizing how that connects to the embodied way one moves through the world. I have lots of clients come in and say their sex life is horrible, and I watch how they sit on my couch, how close they are, how far away they are, how they touch one another, how they back away or lean in. That's not unlike EFT or Gottman method or any of the other methods that might observe that. but I might actually direct them to do particular tasks. What happens when you lean in closer and give her a kiss? What does that do? What do you feel? And I might actually coach them a little bit on how do you have that gaze? What is the comfortable distance? What is the comfortable closeness? What do you feel and what do you want? And some of this is really connected to abandonment issues or differentiation, individuation issues. Some of it is connected to sexual abuse. There's lots of things to unearth in the way in which we are embodied in the world and relative to flirting and eroticism, but it's important to engage.
So it's really important as therapists that the mindfulness and the somatic piece are bridged and brought into that experience. Just with that, I can see how, a lot of times therapy can just focus on, the communication, forgiveness, healing, all these different aspects, which are important. But I can see where that somatic piece really is necessary, especially when, there's been a betrayal that involved, that physical connection, because I think that actually creates that disconnection even more and makes it even more difficult to bring that into a somatic form in the individuals in therapy.
You're absolutely right. It's funny, I'm writing a case study right now about a couple who came to me with all kinds of communication issues, the usual things, and who were really considering divorcing. And so I approached the process from a typical kind of Gottman method approach, looking for the difficulties in communication and kind of looking for the repairs and working through some of the attachment issues. And when I asked them, as I always do, how's your sex life, which probably for many therapists would have felt like a question from out of the blue.
Yeah.
Clearly these people were hostile and really upset and were looking at working through other things. That was the question that allowed them to actually talk about why they hadn't had sex for the last 5 or 6 years. And that was the question that allowed them to consider the possibility that maybe they did actually want to be having sex. And maybe that was what was fueling some of the hostility. So, sex can create motivation for persevering through all of these difficult issues. The difficult stuff in a relationship is not the fun part. And sex isn't always the fun part. But sometimes sex can help.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And the embodiment and so on. Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking how you said at the beginning about asking the questions that matter. And that would definitely be a question that matters, right? How's your sex life? Because like you said, it gives them permission to bring that dialogue into the moment, Yes.
Yeah. It's funny, our training up until 2012 did not require any courses in human sexuality. So anyone who's been licensed before then probably did not take anything that relates to sex and gender. And only now are 10 hours required for licensure as an MFT. Same for a PsyD. So we largely have people out there treating couples in particular, but also individuals who may or may not have a lot of knowledge about sexuality or about relationships themselves. So if we have very young clinicians or clinicians who have particular views on sex and relationships, it's very rare that you get a lot of information about what other people who are doing very different things than you are like. This is why a sex therapist can be incredibly helpful. And we've just launched at CIS, we just launched a sex therapy and sex educator certificate tracks. There are 165 hours of training for clinicians or for folks who want to go into sex education, in part to help facilitate everything from eroticism to pelvic floor pain and difficulties as a gap in clinical knowledge and in the knowledge of the public.
That is a valuable, necessary resource for clinicians. And I'll make sure that we include a link to that information in our show notes. Is the program already going right now? It's available now?
It is. We are accepting applications. It's every spring. It's over 3 weekends.
Okay.
And so the very first weekend will be in January 2017. And then it will be again in January 2018 and so on.
Okay, so it's 3 consecutive
weekends in person.
Okay.
No, it's not 3 consecutive weekends. There's a weekend in January, a weekend in March, and a weekend in April. Okay. And then some materials online thereafter.
And so if there are any clinicians listening and also individuals who are struggling with this, what would be your words of wisdom for them as they begin to work through this?
Yeah. So for clinicians, I think holding space for the possibility that a couple that you're working with may want to divorce, may not want to divorce, may want to open up their relationship, may not want to, and it has nothing to do with your views and your biases and what you think should be a good and healthy answer for them. and to hold space for all of those options throughout the entire therapy is really important. I think sometimes sessions that are separate are really helpful, meaning, giving some airtime to all of the difficult feelings that go on and allowing for each party in the couple to speak freely without implications for how the other might feel is really important in these very heated situations. So I wouldn't hesitate to have a few separate sessions before bringing a couple together that might have a lot of difficulty with hurt feelings and shame and so on. I want to say to everyone that these are really, really common scenarios. And while the connection between infidelity and divorce is incredibly strong, very few couples are able to work this out. It's really quite sad because if it is so common, one could argue that relationships could be repaired potentially, or that monogamy is potentially inclusive of monogamy with infidelity. As it is lived. And so while I would never be thrilled if my husband cheated on me, nor would I be proud of myself if I cheated on him, I also recognize that perhaps working through some of those difficulties, as difficult as it may be, would really develop my ability and his ability to be connected. And there are many examples of this in the clinical literature, and many examples of this that people have talked about. I would also spend a great deal of time working on the idea of eroticism and embodiment, giving people tools to be able to fully impact another person as another subjectivity is what allows them to be full agents in their sexuality. So the shutdown that happens at the beginning of a relationship may have been prevented if people knew how to initiate eroticism or how to negotiate their desires. And we are really, really poor at that. Many, many, many couples are in my office unable to articulate what gives them pleasure, unable to articulate their fantasies and so on because there's so much shame around that. So that's the antidote largely.
So that would include then like learning how to create the atmosphere too for this to happen?
Yes, absolutely. And one more thing I would say, collectively as a culture, we do not have the right stage. We work so many hours. We all have these devices. We navigate on the devices separately. So you see all of these scenarios where people are in restaurants or in cars. And I don't mean to be anti-technology, but this is what's happening relationally, where everyone's looking at their device and everyone is able to command their own preferences in music or in what they take in at the moment, separate and distinct from all the other people in their family. And what that has given rise to is this notion of, if I don't get what I want, I can't tolerate the idea of negotiating with you. In my household, I make sure that my kids have to pick a shared movie. I don't let them go on to two different screens because they can't decide. I'm hoping to build relational skills for marriage later. Not that they would marry themselves, each other, but when they marry someone else, that they would be able to talk to another person and say, no, I don't want to watch that. Could we please have this shared experience? And I think we're training an entire generation of kids to just opt out and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it's happening to our adults too, through these devices. Without the relationship savvy and skills and mindfulness of what a technology device does, we can't really expect people to be able to negotiate with their spouse if they can't negotiate simple transactions.
As you were speaking, what came to mind is that I think there's this myth or this belief that relationships or sexuality, if it's good, it should just happen. Like you shouldn't have to, you shouldn't have to put in effort. It shouldn't be difficult. And I think a lot of times people perceive the effort or the difficulty as meaning something's wrong with our relationship versus that's part of relating,
Yes, you are absolutely right. So the romantic notion that either a marriage and all of the conversations and the sexuality and everything else will go smoothly as indicative of a good relationship. No, I always tell my clients that how you fight is more, or how you negotiate is more indicative of whether or not you have a good relationship. I generally worry about the couples that don't argue or don't negotiate, because it seems to me that regardless, most of the time there is a conflict between two subjectivities. It's bound to happen. And, while we might meet someone who we really get along with, if you spend enough time, there will be a conflict. And so those skills are really, really important.
So I know you mentioned Esther Perel's book, Mating in Captivity. And yes, that is a wonderful resource. Are there any other resources that you would suggest to clinicians or to someone who just wants to learn more about this area?
Yes. There's a gentleman named Jack Morin who wrote The Erotic Mind. And it's all about the idea of the gaze and how to enter into these moments of eroticism and how to exit out of them. Another person who wrote about that was Steen Halling in I think his book is titled something on the order of Intimacy, Transcendence in Everyday Life. Those two books. And then things like, ASECT deals directly with sexuality and arousal and desire disorders, which I think is wonderful. Sex therapy training can be helpful for clinicians. If you are a couple and you're dealing with infidelity issues and you go to see a psychotherapist, you'll get help. But if you go to see a sex therapist who is also a psychotherapist, because you can't be a sex therapist without being a psychotherapist first, with additional training, you will get the benefits of both worlds, and you will have someone who can help you figure out skillfully what it is that's going on in the erotic arousal desire connection or lack thereof that caused you to have this promise and then have it go awry. So I would highly recommend that. There's a lot of philosophical references, of course, that are kind of high level, but Lacan and Freud wrote about this, and Martin Buber, those folks. But I think that's where I would start.
And what is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you?
Email is actually best. And so Nicolle, it's spelled Nicolle .Zapien, Z as in zebra, A P as in Paul, IEN @gmail.com. Or they can go to my website, Nicolle Gottfried, Gottfried, Zapien.com.
And we will make sure that all of these links to the resources that you mentioned, your contact information, your website, also the information on the certification course that you're offering at CIIS, that we'll have all of that in the show notes.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicolle, for coming onto the podcast today and sharing your insights and your wisdom and just this really relevant, meaningful information that I know many therapists will benefit from, and I think will also be very helpful for those who are dealing with infidelity and maybe are struggling to understand it and are looking for support in that area.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Viado.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Dr. Zapien. What stood out for me was the role of mindfulness, eroticism, and embodiment in a marriage and an infidelity, and how, although it can feel like the infidelity just happened for those who engage in it, actually there is a predictable, step-by-step process that leads to crossing the line. For show notes to today's episode, visit www.lourdesviado.com/women in depth, where you will find notes to today's episode along with the links to the resources mentioned. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.